Well, I wonder if you've had that experience. You know how it is when you've made an assumption about something, an assumption possibly for years. It makes total sense to you. It ties up with a lot of the other things that have always made sense to you as well. And why would anyone bother to try and think any other way? I wonder if you can think of anything like that. I wonder. Things like, of course, I bring my shopping home in a plastic shopping bag and put my groceries in the cupboards and the plastic bag in the bin and forget about it. Things like, oh, of course, it's fine to pay the top people 200 times or so more than those who work for them. They're the ones who shoulder the burden of responsibility after all. Or things like, of course, people from ethnic minorities shouldn't complain at the statues of famous slave traders in many of our British cities. It's just part of our history, isn't it? Or things like, of course, zombie films are just a load of nonsense about a lot of crazy people going around eating a lot of slightly less crazy people. They don't mean anything. Well, where on earth is the vicar going with that one? You may well ask yourself this morning. To be honest, I never really thought about it till a couple of years ago when I found myself having, one of those quite serious arty-farty kind of conversations with my son Peter about the meaning of zombie films. I ask you, as if zombie films could have a meaning. I mean, what significance can there possibly be in vast numbers of humans being suddenly infected by something unseen? No, not that something unseen, but something else unseen that turns them in an instant from sentient beings able to reason, communicate and love into shadow creatures that twitch and lurch as they stare into some ill-defined middle distance, unable to connect with anything or with anybody other than by sinking their teeth into them. Except that in so many of these films, and I confess I have watched a few of them since that conversation with my son, the civilized world depicted in those films, the world of the humans unaffected by the zombieism, is seen to be well on its way very often to crazydom anyway, an uncaring, unjust, unequal world spiraling out of control towards some apocalyptic doom just over the horizon. And all the advent of the zombies ever achieves is to hasten an inevitable conclusion to a doomed race. The point is that throughout history, humanity has been hell-bent on steering a path as near to self-destruction as possible, engaging in one thing after another to tempt the fates of apocalypse, whether that apocalypse be one born of ethnocide or racism or religious persecution, witch hunts, or the more global follies of environmental degradation, nuclear destruction, artificial intelligence, or the ceding of power from democratically elected government to transnational corporations, those faceless entities that are answerable to no one. And entire populations look on and do absolutely diddly squat, just like a bunch of zombies, really. Well, let's have a look at our Bible reading. A little pause as the vicar takes his breath. And we're going back to the early accounts of Genesis, where in recent weeks, you may remember, we've seen the perfect world God made, spoiled by human greed and desire, leading to, firstly, that broken relationship between Adam and Eve, their joint broken relationship with their creator God, and further decay and death. And a couple of weeks ago, we had the mayhem and murder of Cain and Abel. The Genesis accounts go on to tell of a spreading of the influence of humanity throughout that part of the world that was known in Bible times, and how that influence was organized and frequently misorganized, with the sins of a sin-sick species growing exponentially, such that by the time of Noah, in our reading this morning, we're told that the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. chapter 6, verses 11 and 12. The forces of zombieism, in other words, are well established, and we imagine crazed human beings rushing around from one state of madness to the next. A lost race, a lost cause. Now, this next bit is interesting, but it's a bit more complicated, so do listen up. Because just as we had with the creation story in chapters 1 and 2, at this point, the Hebrew scriptures kind of paste in a story that was well known throughout the cultures of the Middle East, a story of a great flood, a flood that wipes out humanity with the exception of one man and his family, who's rescued by God. In this case, it's the Hebrew scriptures. It's Noah, of course. It's a great story, so great that not only has every generation been told the story, but lost in the ancient myths of the Near East, so many different versions of that story are known among many different cultures. But the version that we've inherited through the Hebrew scriptures is also a very strange story, which we tend to swallow without questioning very much, with its depiction of a God who sentences humanity to mass extinction, declaring our race to be simply a failure, which is pretty odd if you think about it, isn't it? After all, is that the God that we see in the rest of our Bibles? Do we not rather see a God who not only grieves over his wayward creatures, but who reaches out again and again in love and forgiveness? So what's going on here? Noah himself knows nothing of all this, sitting as he does at the dawn of prehistory. So when God reveals his plan to him to destroy the earth, Noah just goes along with it, secure in the knowledge that he'll be okay, he'll be saved. But of course, Noah isn't the only one in the Bible who's given this kind of divine revelation, is he? Think about it. Just a few chapters later, for example, there's a very similar scene that takes place just outside a city, an evil city called, altogether now, Sodom, where God tells Abraham that the sin of Sodom is such that the entire city must be done away with, along with neighboring Gomorrah. But Abraham, unlike Noah, has walked with God. And immediately his response to hearing this news of judgment, Abraham immediately starts to plead with God for the city to be spared, if just a few righteous people can be found. Scroll forward a few centuries to the Exodus accounts, when God's people have been rescued from slavery in Egypt and immediately played false to God, fashioning and worshipping a pagan-style golden calf, and they worship this thing. And again, God threatens to destroy them all. But Moses intervenes, pleading successfully with God. And gradually through these stories, and they are strange stories, aren't they? We begin to realize that although this God may be well girded with purity and holiness beyond anything we can imagine, the point is that still he is absolutely determined to have truck with humans, soiled as we are. And again, we see him calling the unclean, the impure, the sinful, to use them, to transform them, and to love them. At this point, though, I've got to rein myself in, because next week, James will be looking at the happy ending of the Noah story and how God, through Noah, establishes a covenant with humanity. With that covenant, God strikes out the pagan understanding that he might act on a whim, that God might act on a whim to strike out in anger or to destroy. The pagan gods saw humanity much as human despots see their subjects, as meaningless pieces of meat that can be used and abused at will. But the true and living God reaches out. Our sin, our waywardness is no object to his reach, as God says through Isaiah, for example, in chapter 65. I held out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices. Far from being a God, then, who strikes or who uses violence to achieve his purposes, this God is calling out, pleading for each one to hear, for each one to respond. And he says, I was ready to be sought out by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, here I am. The beginning of the account of Noah describes Noah as righteous and blameless. You remember that description of him, I'm sure. It's good, isn't it? But I think it's fair to say that Noah's righteousness wasn't that of Abraham or of Moses or of the prophets, who all pleaded with God for the lives of others, for the salvation of others. Nor was it the righteousness of our patron, St. Andrew, whom we remember today. Andrew, the brother of Peter. He sits with us here humbly, never making a lot of noise in the gospel accounts. But as we've heard again today, he responds at a word from that passing rabbi. He leaves his nets, his security, his future, in order to follow this Jesus, the one who would ultimately put himself in great danger, but who, unlike Noah, wouldn't need to be rescued, but who would rescue us all, removing every vestige of subhumanity, of zombieism, if you like, healing and restoring us, mending broken hearts, and giving us a sure hope and a certain future. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.